I'm just still getting used to this WebEx platform, so I'm sure I'm going to make a few stumbles here, so just bear with me. Thanks, Hiba, for inviting me to join this series. There have been some great presenters joining in. Some of these webinars have had fascinating subjects, and I'm happy to be able to contribute. And it's great to hear that you're capturing them for posterity's sake as well. One of the things I think I think there's a lot of great content that we all collectively in the Atlantic region generate around forestry, and the more we can capture that and share it, the better. So I look forward to checking some of these out later on YouTube. And thank you, Mary Jane, for having me in. I see quite a few familiar people in the attendance list, so thanks for giving up part of your afternoons in August, which is always precious time to sit in. I purposefully I thought quite a bit about what to call this webinar and what to give it for a title, because on the one hand, it seems quite straightforward how we can use forests to fight climate change. Trees store carbon. There's too much carbon in the air, so we just grow and have more trees, then there will be less carbon and less climate change. But in reality, forests hold such an important and kind of delicate socioeconomic and cultural place in our society that it's a lot more difficult than it sounds, actually figuring out how we can make the rubber hit the road on this matter. And so what I want to focus on today is more on the marketing, the market side of this question, the socioeconomic side of this question, rather than the actual forest management side of this question, because we've known for quite some time why or what type of forestry results in more carbon stored on the landscape, and how it is we can manage our forests to fight climate change. That's quite straightforward. Where it becomes difficult is actually connecting those who are willing to pay for emission reductions, for carbon stored, with the people in the forests that are able to actually store the carbon. That is the difficult piece, making that connection. And so I'm going to focus more in this talk this afternoon on that side of things. So just for a little bit of background, and Hiba provided some of it, the Climate Forest Company is a partnership we're a for-profit corporation that was started up as a partnership between myself and Community Forest International. And we built the Climate Forest Company to be able to take what we had learned and some of the practices we had learned in developing the only carbon offset projects in Eastern Canada, in New Brunswick, and take those efforts to scale and achieve a more regional and eventually hopefully a national impact of using forests to fight climate change. I see climate change as the new organizing principle for the forestry sector. And I think that's been evident for about a decade now, that forests are only becoming increasingly more valuable for their ability to capture and store carbon relative to the traditional uses of forests. So if we look at roundwood saw timber and pulp and other traditional uses of forests, the value of those have lost ground to the value of capturing and storing carbon over the past 10 years. And that is a process and a trend that I believe will continue and will only accelerate as we move forward. And so the Climate Forest Company's mission is to use forests to fight climate change. And that's through, briefly, climate smart forestry. So what is the actual forestry? What is it that best captures and stores carbon, and not only captures and stores it, but stores it in such a way that that carbon can be maintained on the landscape. Of course, we all know, we can all imagine a stand of 40-year-old balsam fir in southwestern Nova Scotia. It stores a lot of carbon, but that carbon is very delicately stored. It's very precarious because at 40 years, we know in southwestern Nova Scotia, balsam fir is past its best before date. And so what are the type of forestry practices we need to maintain to maintain that carbon on the land? Also, we can use our forests to fight climate change by developing low carbon supply chains. So how is it that we get these products from climate smart forestry into supply chains in such a way that confers more value back to the managers of the forest? And also with using forests to substitute fossil fuel usage. So on the biomass and on the energy side of things, how can we intelligently make use of the products of climate smart forestry to displace the use of fossil fuels, but do it in such a way that results in a net reduction of emissions into the atmosphere, rather than a net increase of emissions into the atmosphere. That's enough about the Climate Forest Company. Like I mentioned, it seems really straightforward. Use forests to fight climate change. Trees absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. They take that carbon, store it in their biomass, store it in what they grow. They store it in the soils. One interesting stat I heard recently, I think it was from UBC, was somewhere between 20 and 60% of all the sugars that are produced via photosynthesis by a tree, 20 to 60% are actually given off to mycorrhizal fungi, are released from the trees to the mycorrhizal fungi. Now that's a huge amount of energy. That's a huge amount of the photosynthetic capacity of a tree and sugar and carbon that gets injected into the soil every year. And of course, it's not a one-way exchange. Trees give the mycorrhizal fungi sugars, and the mycorrhizal fungi in return provide water and minerals in a symbiotic relationship. But trees, all which is to say that trees store carbon very effectively in their biomass and also by transferring it into the soil itself. And in fact, there's somewhere around twice as much carbon in the top meter of soil as there is in the entire above ground portion of a forest. So it seems very straightforward that if trees store carbon and we have too much carbon in the air, then if we have more trees, we have less carbon in the air and less climate change, and that's a good thing. In reality, it's much different to actually implement practices and policies that result in a retention of more trees on the landscape. Now, forestry is worth something like 1.25% of Canada's GDP. I forget what year that stat was for, and I had it in my notes, but this isn't showing me my notes, so it's not going to let me cheat. Anyway, it's something around 1.25% of Canada's GDP comes from forests. That's a huge contributor to the socioeconomic fabric of our economy, of our country. And if we reduce the amount of trees that we cut and lumber that we produce, then we are going to drive people who build buildings to use more building materials like concrete and steel that actually has a higher net carbon footprint than does lumber. And so figuring out how we can incentivize and encourage people to capture and store more carbon in forests and keep that carbon on the landscape is a much more difficult socioeconomic problem than it seems firsthand. So there's two main strategies of how we can fight climate change with forests. And I'm going to focus on the second here because I think it's a little more relevant to today's conversation. But the first strategy is using the products that we harvest from a forest to displace high emission building materials and fuels with carbon neutral ones. So for example, that's like using a wood 2x4 rather than an aluminum 2x4 in building construction, and using wood chips rather than fuel oil to heat in rural Nova Scotia. The second strategy is, so that first strategy is all about how do we use what we take from the forest to displace higher emission materials and fuels. The second strategy is to capture and store more carbon in the forests themselves. So, like I said, I'm going to focus on that second one a little bit more, but just to touch on the first strategy, there's a lot of really interesting things of how there's a lot of technologies and techniques that are being used to displace high emission building materials and fuels with low carbon materials and fuels. And you'll have to ignore my email notifications that pop up. I'm assuming you guys are seeing those. The picture that I have here of Brock Commons is a 13-story dorm that UBC built. 2016, I think, is when they finished. Yeah, well, there it is. They started in June and they ended in August. And it was built 70% out of wood. 18-story, there you go. It was built, the building materials, about 70% of it was wood. The rest was concrete and steel. Now, normally this size of a building would be completely built with concrete and steel and glass. And this has been one way that's been promoted as how we can use forests to fight climate change by displacing the use of concrete that produces an ungodly amount of carbon dioxide, and steel, which obviously high energy use, yada, yada, yada. A similar fuel substitution or material substitution push has been made to take wood chips to use for space heating rather than oil and propane natural gas. And these all have a very obvious emission benefit to them. But the climate benefit that comes from this kind of fuel and material substitution approach to using forests to fight climate change is completely dependent on the type of forestry practices that are used. The type of forestry practices that are used to produce the 2x4, the logs that go into the 2x4, or the pulpwood that gets chipped up, or biomass that gets chipped up. The type of forestry practices that are used lock in or ensure a certain emission profile or climate benefit sequestration method. Clearcut forestry, because it mobilizes the carbon stored in soils, there's a strong argument to be made that it produces building materials that are actually worse for the climate than steel, concrete, or you just directly burning fossil fuels. And so if we're going to take this approach to using forests to fight climate change, we've got to be using climate smart forestry. And climate smart forestry is forestry that takes into account the carbon balance before and after harvesting and in the growth of the forest in the ensuing years. So climate smart forestry retains high levels of standing biomass at all times. So you're trying to retain as many healthy trees on the landscape at any given time. It minimizes soil exposure so as to not release the carbon that's stored in that mycorrhizal biomass and in the soil itself. And it grows old, large trees before they're cut. And large trees, the reason why it grows large trees is because large trees have a higher percentage of the volume of wood or carbon that's in those trees that ends up going through into a long-lived building material relative to the amount of short-lived material. It has to do with lumber recovery and whatnot. And I don't want to go any further down that rabbit hole because that's not really what I want to talk about today. Suffice it to say that substituting building materials and fuels from forests as a climate change mitigation strategy, it only works if we're doing the right type of forestry. Hiva, please let me know if I'm coming up on my timelines, because I have no clock or anything here. So you just get my attention somehow. Anyway, so the second strategy for using forests to fight climate change is actually storing more carbon in the forests themselves. And this is where something like a carbon credit, a carbon offset comes into play. And this is where I want to focus the majority of my time today. So, like I said, it seems bloody obvious. Trees store carbon. Let's have more trees. We'll have more carbon. But in reality, it's a lot more difficult. Traditionally, the only things that have the only way anyone has generated revenue from a forest at a large scale has been to take those live standing trees, convert them into dead logs, and then sell the logs. And so that is the reason why across Canada we've been converting our living forests into dead logs, is to generate that revenue. So 20 or so years ago, maybe a little more now, people came up with, economists and environmental economists came up with the concept of the carbon credit as a way to try to balance out that economic driver converting living forests into dead logs. And that carbon credit is an economic incentive to move carbon storage up the hierarchy of management objectives on a forest manager's priority list. So by monetizing the live standing forest and paying people to maintain those live standing forests, we thereby created a new revenue generating mechanism that encouraged people to keep their live standing forests living and standing, and relatively lessened the incentive to convert those live standing forests into dead logs. In an Econ 101 textbook or environmental policy textbook, it makes a lot of sense, and it even seems relatively straightforward. But there are some real pros and cons, some drawbacks especially, to using a carbon credit to try to incentivize a certain type of management. Now, on the pro side of things, carbon credits, when applied at scale, can create large and valuable incentives to prioritize a certain type of forest management. But on the drawback side of things, there's a lot of questions that have been asked over the last 20 years of, well, how do we know the carbon that's stored in the forest in day one is going to be stored in subsequent years? And is this just a permission to pollute? That's a question that I get asked a lot. And then the question that I've been asking myself over the last 3, 4, 5 years more and more is, well, why hasn't this materialized at scale, right? If these carbon credits are a great thing and it's a great way to incentivize a different type of forest management and fight climate change, is it so great if it can't happen at a scale that is relevant to the atmosphere? And so looking at these carbon credits and how they've been used, we really saw an uptick in the interest in carbon credits starting in the mid-2000s and for about a decade. And there were a lot of big companies that jumped on with voluntarily imposed policies of purchasing carbon credits as an offset for the emissions that their business activities were creating. So I remember a few years ago, Disney was purchasing something like $14 million worth of carbon credits a year voluntarily to offset the emissions from their theme parks, their productions, and mostly from their cruises. This was an article from 2013 from The Guardian. You know, Microsoft, Shell, Disney, these are the biggest firms. And what they wanted to be seen to do was do right by the climate, demonstrate their corporate social responsibility. But this, as I said, this initial version, this version 1.0 of carbon offsetting, while it's been taken to another level in some limited jurisdictions like California, and to a certain extent in Europe, when applied at a regulatory level, it still hasn't come back to be relevant to us in the Maritimes, or really relevant to many people across the country. And over the past few years, I've started to notice a bit of a different approach that's been taken by corporations who want to demonstrate their corporate social responsibility to counteracting their emissions. And before I get there, I just wanted, yeah, that's right. I wanted to touch on, forgot about my Doug Ford slide. I wanted to touch on Canada's carbon markets. So as I mentioned, some jurisdictions have taken these carbon credits, applied them in a regulatory context to create larger scale carbon credit markets. California in particular has driven this. And there have been tens of billions of dollars worth of carbon credits sold to registered polluters in California that have gone back to forest managers and owners to pay for and incentivize a certain type of forest management. And there's been some really, in the United States, and there's been some really interesting projects come out of that. Around 2016, 2017, when Justin Trudeau's first government announced that they were going to be putting in place a price on carbon across the country, it looked like we were heading in this direction. It seemed for a while there that it was inevitable. We had 84% of the Canadian population living under some price on carbon, some form of carbon pricing, before the federal government even put in place its carbon pricing mandate, which was a really interesting thing that a lot of people didn't realize. The majority of Canadians were living under a carbon price before Trudeau even put in place this price on carbon. And it looked like this was a one-way street we were going down. And that was until about 2018, I guess it was, when there was an election in Ontario. The Progressive Conservatives were elected, and Doug Ford the next day announced that he was going to be ending the province's cap and trade system. And when that also coincided with the election of several conservative governments in some influential provinces across the country, that really provided some headwind or some resistance to that one-way progression up a track to a national carbon market. And so since 2016, 2017, we've been promised by the federal government that they would have developed a pan-Canadian framework and a framework for a Canadian market, carbon market. They're always working on it, and yet it's failed to materialize into anything tangible. Things like the Ford government getting elected really slowed it down, threw some grit into the works. And we still have no broad market for forest-based offsets across the country, which is to say that still, by far the most valuable thing for us to do with our healthy living forests is to convert them into dead logs. And that has continued to be the primary driver across the country. And COVID-19 has actually complicated this even more. There was a voluntarily imposed mandate by the International Civil Aviation Organization that is a bunch of airlines that represent 1.5% of global emissions, that we're going to be capping emission levels at 2020 levels. Now half of them are going to be lucky just to see the end of 2020. So suffice it to say that the outlook for carbon offsets and carbon credits at a regulatory level coming home to us in the Maritimes anytime before 2025 looks pretty poor. So as I mentioned, as I started to say earlier, over the past few years, I've started to see a change in what corporations who were voluntarily choosing to offset their emissions as a way to demonstrate their corporate social responsibility, a change in the approach that they were taking towards paying for emission reductions as an offset, there's a lot of different ways to frame that. But and one of the most interesting ones that came up was fairly recent, the company called Stripe, and they're actually a private sector tech company. And what they did was they released about a year ago. This is from August 2019. They released a white paper outlining the approach that they were going to be taking to offset the effect of their emissions from their business operations. And what they put out there was an ask to the climate change mitigation world, saying, if you have a way that you think that you can pull carbon out of the atmosphere, regardless of what stage you're at, whether it's a fully deployed technology or something that you're working on, let us know. And come to us with a proposal if there's a way for us to support you. We're going to be spending $1 million a year on this. We're going to commit $1 million a year to this. And we want to support some of the most impactful and groundbreaking technologies and processes that are out there to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and to reduce emissions. And what came out of it was about 3 months ago, they announced who the winners were for the people that came to them with proposals that they selected. And it was not limited to the forestry sector. It was broadly applied across the technology sector, forestry, agriculture, everything. And they did not look to go out and buy a certain number of tons of offsets that would match up with their tons of emissions. They just wanted to support at a reasonable price point the opportunity or the development of an opportunity to capture and store carbon. Some of the money went to Carbon Engineering, which is a Squamish-based company that directly pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and turns it into a high-quality liquid fuel. But this was kind of the capstone of a series of what I think of as custom bilateral agreements, contracts that have been developed between those with the capacity to capture and store carbon and those with the money to pay for that capture and storage of carbon, custom agreements, custom contracts, in a way that is outside of some of the cumbersome and problematic carbon credit accounting frameworks that provides a few advantages relative to carbon credit. So it's less administrative burden, a direct trade relationship that better addresses the needs of both sides of the contract and that of the surrounding community. So for example, I've seen companies who have chosen to offset emissions in a forested region and also back that up with support for water conservation because they use a lot of water, and support for support for other environmental damage mitigation projects that are directly in relation to different parts of their supply chain. But there are also some drawbacks. So on the one hand, you have less administrative burden, which means you can produce these things at a lower price point. You can do this at a lower price point. But you also lose some of the advantages of carbon credits, which is a very strict and robust accounting framework to make sure that these emission reductions are legitimate. While it's obvious how this can work on the technology side of things, it's a little more difficult to make it work for forests. And without those surrounding frameworks that have developed over the past 20 years, the third-party frameworks that have developed over the past 30 years, it's not clear how it can work for forests. And also, can it scale? So the advantage of a carbon credit and a carbon offset is the development of a market. And that market can be applied using templates that we've applied to things like sulfur dioxide emissions, to be applied across entire industries and the entire economy to take it to scale. It's not clear that these things can scale, but it is a trend that those corporations who are voluntarily choosing to offset their emissions seem to be moving towards. And so to put it on a bit of a spectrum, on the left-hand side, carbon credit version 1.0, the Disney, just I've got this many tons of emissions, give me this many tons of offsets. And on the other side, custom bilateral contracts like that undertaken by Stripe. We see corporations, and some of the biggest corporations in the world, falling now onto this spectrum in a way that matches their corporate culture and matches their own sense of duty and their own sense of purpose. So, Amazon announced the climate pledge, which was really, they committed, I forget the size now. It was huge chunk of money towards basically creating on the one side, a grant program to support developing initiatives and technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also the purchase of things like offsets. Apple, a few years ago now, I guess it was, they worked with some environmental NGOs in the States. They purchased a conservation easement to 36,000 hectares of land in Maine. Now, it wasn't the purchase of the conservation easement and the expenditure was not tied directly to a certain number of tons of emissions offset. It was more, they had a vague understanding of the amount of carbon they could retain and would retain through time. And they wanted to, they used a lot of paper. They wanted to conserve forests as a way to mitigate some of that paper usage. And then Microsoft doing what Microsoft does, which falls closer to the carbon credit side of things, where they're looking to be rely heavily on the carbon offsets and also invest in directly reducing their emissions with the goal of becoming carbon negative by 2030. And so to come back to our the kind of question I posed to kick this off, which is how do we get from where we are today, which is forests are most valued for their living, standing forests are most valued when they're converted into dead logs. How do we get from there to actually paying people more to do right by the climate in their forest management? My experience and my feelings on this question today are very different than where they were in 2016 when the national framework on carbon pricing was released, where I think it's less likely that we're going to move towards a large-scale regulatory framework whose foundation is the carbon credit. And we're going to move more in the direction of these custom bilateral contracts where it becomes the burden of the forest manager and the entrepreneur to package the environmental attributes of the properties that they manage and find a corporate partner, likely a corporate partner, to support them to do more of the good things that they're already doing. This focus on finding a product market fit is critical. And that, not to get jargony, but we who are interested in managing our forests in such a way that fights climate change, that is better at storing and filtering water, that provides more biodiversity, that creates more green local jobs. We need to do a better job at packaging and communicating those products, those environmental products, and connecting those products with the customers who are out there that will support that will purchase those products, the market for them. We need to do a better job of packaging, communicating, and connecting with those customers in a way that not only meets the needs of the customer, but also is authentic, right? Because as I mentioned, on these bilateral type agreements, that authenticity piece is critical. I really think that it's difficult to see a large regulatory-based market emerge before 2025. That's simply because government moves slowly, and government policy is also very precarious. So back to the example of Ontario and the Doug Ford government, it took about a decade for the Ontario Liberals to develop their cap and trade framework. 2.5 years before the election that Doug Ford won, they hired a consultancy out of the US to develop their carbon offsetting protocols for the forests and whatnot. And they were 6 months away from completing those when Doug Ford got elected. And in 10 days, that Doug Ford government was able to undo about 10 years of policy making on the part of the Ontario Liberals. And that was a really harsh lesson, but an important one that it's it's a lot easier to go backwards than it is to go forwards. And so in the absence of being able to rely on those regulatory markets, those of us who are trying to crack this nut have to be able to come up with a strategy of getting to market that doesn't involve such precarious systems. And the more creative, the better. This essentially, I look at this whole using forests to fight climate change. Sorry, that was my dog. Using forests to fight climate change question as less a technical challenge and more a marketing and communications challenge. And that's been an interesting realization that there are those people, those companies, those individuals out there that want to do right by the climate. They want to support these kinds of good, green, fuzzy projects they can wrap their arms around. But it's up to us to be able to package them appropriately. So, Hiba, I saw your note there. I've gone on longer than I thought I was. But I'm happy to take some questions now. Hopefully that made some sense, and you all found something useful out of that.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. A lot of information, maybe more depressing, but hopefully it was a little more positive at the end there. Okay, so we do have a couple questions. So in regards to climate smart forestry and your note about how it's a pro to grow old large trees before they're cut, doesn't mass timber, mass timber doesn't really need large old trees. So is there still an economic incentive to grow old trees in the age of mass timber?
Yeah, so from an emissions perspective, it's less important the specific diameter of lumber that you're producing from a log than it is the ratio of lumber that comes out of a log to total volume of that log. Because if your concern is to move as much of the carbon in a log into a building material that will have a long life, like a piece of mass timber, versus moving some of the carbon that's in that log into a forest product that will have a very short life, like biomass or pulp and paper, then you want to have as much recovery of lumber from that round cylinder log as possible. And so the larger the diameter of the log, the higher the percentage of the total volume of the log that goes into a long-lived forest product is. And so even though you can have a small log and produce a 2x4 or 2x6 out of it, a higher percentage of the total volume of that small log ends up as pulp and paper that gets emitted into the atmosphere more quickly. So it's not necessarily an easy thing to explain, but hopefully that explains it. Even though timber technology and we can glue things back together, it's always better to start with a larger diameter log than a smaller diameter one.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question. So is another con of version 1 of forest carbon credits the ease of conning people? So in other words, scamming.
Yeah, I mean that was my point about, is this legit? Is there a legitimate climate benefit from this? There was a report recently released out of Europe somewhere looking at third-party certification programs in general. So they looked at the Forest Stewardship Council, they looked at Fair Trade International, all these kind of stamps that go on a product that say this has some desirable, beneficial, social or environmental outcome associated with its production. And they found that basically none of them were hitting the mark. So they looked at fair trade, they weren't able to find and look down the supply chain, and they weren't able to find that there was really any benefit going back to the workers and whatnot, the people who are actually doing the work, those people who are producing fair trade certified products versus those who weren't. Same with FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, excuse me. They were not able to really discern any desirable environmental outcome as a result of FSC certification. All which is to say that these large third-party validation, verification, certification schemes, whatever you want to call them, by turning things into a process and institutionalizing these checks and balances, you dehumanize them, you remove the people from them. And it allows a lot of nefarious actors to hide behind these institutional certifications. And so by taking the people out of it and taking the personal out of it, yeah, it does actually make it a lot easier for nefarious actors to hide behind those certifications and to con people. So that's one of the benefits, I think, of these direct bilateral agreements. Is there's a face associated with them. You need to build trust. You need to maintain trust, and if that trust is compromised, you have no product. And there's something much more honest and personal about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think, given this requirement to rely on marketing to individual corporations, that a high percentage of Nova Scotia forests could be marketed this way?
Yeah, I mean, a high percentage. What is considered a high percentage? 10% or 50 plus one? I think even at the higher scale, 60, 70% of the forest, we absolutely could. I mean, we've already seen similar orders of magnitude of land base be moved for storing carbon in the California system. Nova Scotia is not that big, 2.5 million private hectares, I believe. My numbers are a little bit rusty. Small private woodlots. Yeah, absolutely. That we could. There is the demand for that out there. It's just demand for the emission reductions from that scale of a land base out there. We just need to make the connection with those consumers and do it in such a way that works for the people on the ground and works for the consumers.
Okay, great, thanks. So going back to climate smart forestry, so in essence, you're saying we can still practice climate smart forestry, we just need a different way of packaging it.
Yeah, packaging the non-timber attributes of it, the environmental attributes of it, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Another couple questions. So do you know of instances where voluntary offset organizations / companies are bundling offsets from green/forest sources with offsets from blue carbon / wetlands?
I mean, I'm not sure what is meant by bundled. I know there are forest green projects, and then there are blue carbon projects, although the blue carbon verification is really difficult. It's really expensive, even more so than forests, although the volumes are higher. So the way the account, I mean, this is I don't want to get too far into the weeds on the accounting side because it's terribly boring. I get, sometimes I'm disappointed with myself that this stuff takes up so much space in my own head. But the accounting of it, you would separate the two projects and treat them as two separate projects, and they might be intertwined, but you would treat them as two separate projects. So I'm not sure what the asker of the question means by bundled, but
yeah. Okay, great. So just gonna move on. How can this work in a Nova Scotia context? So what is the carbon credit regulatory framework here, if any? Can a company in Ontario buy carbon credits in Nova Scotia, for example?
So I'm going to assume that the questioner was referring to the regulatory markets. What does a regulatory market framework look like in Nova Scotia? And can someone who is regulated in Ontario purchase offsets from Nova Scotia? So on the first question, what does the regulatory environment look like in Nova Scotia? Easy answer, there is none. There's no market on the regulatory side of things, and there's no framework for generating carbon offsets to move into that market. That's a function of how the government set up the cap and trade program. And a real opportunity was lost when that happened. Now, the government has since gone back and they're trying to figure out what is the capacity of the province to produce offsets, generate offsets. What they were worried about was that Nova Scotian emitters would have to purchase offsets from out of province actors, and we'd have a bunch of money flowing out of province, and they got that wrong. But can someone in Ontario purchase offsets from Nova Scotia? Well, right now the way the federal Ontario emitters are regulated under the federal emission framework, and the federal government still has not developed a framework for generating carbon offsets from forests in any province in Canada. So the quick answer to that is no, you can't, because while it is allowed under the regulations, there's no how-to steps to get from no offset to an offset to sell. So while it is technically possible, it's impossible. It's a mess. The pan-Canadian framework is a mess. The federal government should have come out and said, this is what you're doing, provinces. You're not allowed to do your own thing. We're getting on the same page by 2020. Start coming in line. And I think the Trudeau government was trying to work with premiers who wanted to work with them at the time. And then a whole bunch of premiers got voted in that actually don't want to work with the feds and don't believe in climate change. And they're fighting it every bit of the way, and they've turned it into a complete morass. So yeah, that's depressing. It's just...
Yeah, absolutely. So on a lighter note, what tools are available to forest managers for modeling carbon stored in forests?
So the best tool that's out there for modeling carbon storage was developed by the Canadian Forest Service. It's called CBM CFS3, Carbon Budget Model by the Canadian Forest Service, version 3. I don't know what exact version they're in right now. Anyway, it's the Canadian Forest Service will come to your place of employment, to your workplace, and they will give you a training on this. They've got a really great team that'll help you out understanding how to work with this tool. It allows you to provide the inputs on forest management, so the type of forest, how it grows, the type of cutting you want to do, and see all the outcomes from a carbon storage perspective over hundreds of years into the future. And it gives you a breakdown based on standing carbon in trees, below ground, dead coarse woody material, and stored in forest products as you harvest them and move carbon from trees into forest products, and then it slowly declines over time. That's the best tool that's out there. There is something else that across my desk by someone in the States. I can't remember the name of it now. I could dig it up and provide it to you, Hiba. Maybe you could pass it along. But none of them are as robust as that CBM CFS3. Governments around the world are using it. The difficulty is that you basically have to be paid to learn it and operate it. It's kind of like ArcGIS. You can't just flirt with it on and off. You need to get into the program, understand the language, keep your head in there. And so for someone like me, I bounce in and out of it. It's always difficult to relearn it. But other than that, there's not a whole heck of a lot. For people who are on the ground measuring trees, I've developed some spreadsheets and some equations and Excel sheets that tell me when I measure the height and the diameter and species of a tree, exactly how much carbon is in it. But that's something I privately developed. There's very little to none of that out there, unfortunately. Yeah, so I'm not sure which resolution the questioner was asking about, whether it's the individual tree, woodlot, or landscape level. But those are really at the landscape level. That's about the only place that we're reasonably well served.
Okay, great. Well, if you want to send me any of those links, I usually send out a thank you email. So I think that would be a great addition to have and send out and share.
Great.
So moving on, given that a national framework for carbon credits is not likely to be established in the near future, do you think it's worth developing such a framework at a provincial level, i.e. something similar to the ALUS program where landowners could be paid to keep forests on the land or use climate smart forestry?
I mean, it always would be nice to see the provincial government be so proactive and lead on something like that. The difficulty is that Nova Scotia has a small industrial emitting base relative to the size of the forest. And so what that means is that you have low demand and high supply. So even if you're successful at developing something like this in Nova Scotia, you have small demand, high supply, which results in poor dollars. In the United States, the situation is completely opposite. There's generally, across the US as a whole, there's a high industrial emitting capacity relative to the amount of forest land available. So that flips the scales in the other direction. Now, that being said, well, Nova Scotia has a difficult time leading on something like that because we're so small. Ontario was trying to lead on something like that. Ontario, when they hired the consultants out of California to develop the protocols, the frameworks for forest offsets, that's what they were trying to do. And they were trying to get other provinces to join on to what's called the Western Climate Initiative, which is California as well. They were trying to pull everyone under one framework. They were leading. The provincial Liberals in Halifax were offered the opportunity. The people from Ontario under Kathleen Wynne's government came down and lobbied the Nova Scotia government to join, and they didn't. And that was a real loss. That was a real missed opportunity. So it's always nice to see a provincial government be proactive on this stuff. That being said, even if the provincial government was successful, I'm not bullish on what could be accomplished from that market. I don't mean to be overly pessimistic about this stuff, but there's a lot that I've learned in the past decade of dealing with this and working on this file. And those are hard lessons. And almost every one of these lessons that I've learned represents a year or more that I could have saved had I not misunderstood the dynamics here. So to me, knowing that something is not one way is just as valuable is almost as valuable as knowing that it's actually the other way. Like having certainty on the negative side of things is just as important to me as having certainty on the positive side of things. So I'm trying to be as clear as possible and confer as many of these things that I've learned the hard way as possible.
Great. So kind of on that note as well, do you see any role for federal or provincial? In an ideal world, what sort of government support would you want to see?
I mean, a national and an international framework on regulating, pricing and regulating emissions. I mean, that's the one we need. That's what drives builders in Halifax to start using cross-laminated timber and mass timber. That's what drives building administrators to switch from burning oil to burning ecologically sourced wood chips. That's what drives the demand for carbon offsets. And the larger that market can be, the better. That is kind of the best case scenario for the role of governments in this, is provide the framework, provide the oversight, and let it go. It's unfortunate that climate change has become such a political litmus test, almost an identity litmus test in the culture wars. But if I were looking for the government to do anything, that's what it would be.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I just want to make a comment regarding to the carbon tools question. So James Steenberg has offered to contact the Department of Lands and Forestry at his email, which I can link back to in the thank you email. And he's mentioning that they're working on carbon modeling tools for forest landowners and managers and may be able to assist. So I want to put that out there, but I'll link that out too.
I'd love, just to James, I'd love to get have a call and just hear what you guys are working on these days. It would be interesting.
Sounds good. I could definitely, I'll send James an email and then I'll CC you. Oh, we have more questions. Okay. It sounds as if another thing you'd like the Nova Scotia government to do is to facilitate the creation of the links between Nova Scotia woodlot owners and the corporate markets.
Well, I'm not sure I'd want the government to do that, because I want to say this delicately, but the government is slow. The government is really slow, and governments change. And I'm not sure I want to trust them with such an important relationship, because if one of the biggest biggest expenses in this is making that connection with the consumer, with the customer, and managing that relationship. And if there's another entity in between the person who's developing the project and the consumer that slows the whole process down, even a marginal increase in the time that it takes just balloons those costs even further. So it would be nice if the government would be able to support at a foundational level the organizing structure to pull landowners and pull the land base together. But I don't think I'd want them on the marketing or on the customer relations side of things. Yeah, sorry, I just saw a little bit of your comment, Brian, I think it is. Maybe you could follow up on that.
Yeah, so the comment is, I'm thinking of the model that is used these days to facilitate entrepreneurial activity through entrepreneurial hubs as an example.
Yeah, we probably just have to have a conversation about exactly what you're referring to. I'm not sure I completely follow, but it would be interesting to hear what you think.
It is always a little difficult with a webinar to facilitate that conversation, yeah, especially with someone in the middle.
Thanks, Eva. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. But your email is right there, and
yeah,
you can always have like a conversation. I think that's it for questions. So thank you, Dale, for coming in and presenting and answering so many questions. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone who participated. Yeah, it's great to see the engagement from everyone. We have one more webinar scheduled and potentially a second one. I'm not quite sure yet. I'll have that worked in through the week. But next week's webinar is on multi-value forest management at Halliburton Forest. And that was actually scheduled for July, and then it got rescheduled. So if anyone was interested in signing up, you'll still get a chance to see it. Other than that, thanks again, Dale and everyone. I hope you guys have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.